Electronic Arts was founded in 1982 by Trip Hawkins, who quickly grew the company to one of the largest development and publishing houses in the world. In 1991, he left EA to create the 3DO company and focus on cutting-edge hardware. The result was the 3DO system released in 1993. The 3DO was unique among game consoles as 3DO developed the hardware while leaving manufacturing, marketing, and distribution to third parties. The main players were Matsushita, also known as Panasonic, Sanyo, and Gold Star, later renamed LG after their merger with Lucky Chemical. The system was a powerhouse available for the steep price of $699 US, keeping it out of the reach of most households and mainstream distribution lines. With sales starting to pick up and the market shifting to full 3D games utilizing high-powered hardware, an add-on called the M2 was developed with the intention of extending the system's already short life. As development progressed, it became clear that the vision for the upgrade wasn't in line with the limitations of the current hardware. With that, the project moved to a new standalone system under the official name 3DO M2 or Model 2 with an intended release in 1996. All hardware, software, and manufacturing partners from the original system were enthusiastically on board and anticipated big things. Even Sega entertained the idea of making the M2 their next Sega system, one that would replace the Saturn. Things were looking great until the presidents of Panasonic and Sega met and developed a dislike for each other. Sega pulled out, leaving a financial support gap for 3DO. Knowing this, Panasonic attempted to strong-arm the 3DO company out of the hardware in order to sell it as an exclusive Panasonic console. Through negotiations, a deal was struck and the M2 was sold to Panasonic for $100 million. Panasonic wasn't new to gaming hardware as they were already the biggest backer of 3DO hardware and had produced the most popular models of the original system. Panasonic for their part would make revision after revision, pushing back the unreleased system to 1998. By the close of 97, the technology was growing old, and fears about more powerful next-generation hardware from Sega and Sony led to the decision to cancel the home release. Its final legacy is one of a complete console that never released with a handful of finished games, a controller that appears to have heavily influenced the Nintendo 64, and a lingering question about what could have been. It's a story of a gaming console so advanced that it was impossible to produce at a price anyone could afford, slowly becoming a system people could afford with tech that wasn't quite good enough to bring it to market. One key aspect of the M2 was its intended arcade crossover. The system was designed to be powerful enough for use in arcades, making home conversions dirt cheap. This was a similar model to what SNK had done with Neo Geo, and Sega would later do with their Dreamcast and Naomi. There was also the rather unique decision to limit who could develop for the system and what kind of game would be allowed. 3DO had referred to these studios as the Dream Team and had made it clear games not suitable for the arcade or that didn't push the hardware wouldn't be welcome on the M2, at least near its launch. When it comes to the M2, the system was in development for 4 years, resulting in a number of unreleased games. So expect this to be an ongoing series. There are a couple things to note before we get started. This is mostly going to be alphabetic. I say mostly because if I miss a game, I will include it in a future episode. The rules for inclusion are simple. There has to be some proof that the game was in development, be it an article in a magazine, known copy of a prototype, a retail order sheet, an interview with a developer, etc. With that, let's get started. This is Retro Impressions Unreleased 3DO M2. Army Men was originally in development for the M2 as an exclusive release. The game was a Command & Conquer style RTS set in World War II with plastic army men replacing lifelike soldiers. With the M2 being cancelled, the game was moved to PC and has never released for a home console. It was fairly well received and would eventually become the most popular game associated with the 3DO brand, with over 20 games across countless gaming platforms being released over the next decade. Batman Forever, the arcade game, was developed for Sega's Titan video hardware. It was a side-scrolling beat-em-up much in the vein of Double Dragon, Final Fight, and Streets of Rage. As you might imagine, it was based on the movie of the same name, even using digitized assets from the film. At the time of its release, the game reviewed poorly, not due to visual or control issues, but the lack of innovation when compared to similar games released years earlier. The game was set for release on the Saturn and 32X, which utilized similar hardware to the Titan. Ports to the PC, PSX, and M2 were to follow. Of the planned releases, the 32X and 3DO M2 versions never shipped. Battle Isle was a game series focusing on a technically advanced turn-based tactics experience that only saw release on PC and Amiga systems. By the time the game was in development for the M2, the series had shifted from a hexagonal grid to a style reminiscent of XCOM. It's likely that the M2 game was based on the same engine used for their well-received Incubation, Time is Running Out. It's even possible that Incubation was the game in development for the M2. Battle Isle was mentioned a number of times as being in development, but there were never enough details given to determine anything beyond that. One of the last games released on the 3DO was Battlesport. The game was well received and a sequel put into production for the M2. With the uncertainty of the new system and 3DO becoming a software company, the project was moved to the N64 disk drive and the PSX, where at least one stage of the game was completed. Funding was eventually pulled as the publisher felt the direction the game was heading was not in line with the game they can market. Battletrist is the first of 5 games we'll be talking about through this series that were released to the public using actual 3DO M2 hardware in Japanese arcades. While none of these games were announced for home release, the hardware is identical, and these games almost certainly would have released for the home had the option been available. As far as this game goes, it was a 3D fighter designed as Konami's answer to the popular Tekken and Virtua Fighter series. It never really caught on with the public and has remained exclusive to the M2. Clay Fighters 3 was first announced as an M2 launch title in 1995, with a number of mentions through to the following year. By the summer of 1996, it was part of a growing list that included nearly finished games certain to be launch titles for the system. The game would eventually move to the less powerful Nintendo 64 and release to dismal reviews. An updated version called Sculptor's Cut would later release as a Blockbuster exclusive, becoming one of the rarest games on the system. The end legacy of this game is one that ended a popular series while giving the N64 one of its 2 exclusive 2D tournament fighters. The D Trilogy in many minds is Kenji Ino's epic masterpiece that continues to drive what-if conversations in small circles of the most hardcore fans. The original game was developed as a 3DO exclusive after Ino visited the newly opened 3DO Japanese offices and received a warm welcome. They were willing to offer a reasonable licensing fee and the freedom he desired from censorship in making games. In Japan, the game would be 3DO's first bona fide hit, quickly gaining a cult following that's still active to this day. It would go on to sell over 1 million units on multiple platforms, and in the process, Sony pissed off Ino by only pressing and distributing 25% of the total copies that were pre-sold for its PlayStation launch. With dev kits being made available for the M2, Ino decided to end the series with a game exclusive to 3DO's new system. The original game relied on full motion video to supplement its technical visuals, but the M2 was so powerful, this new game could be fully rendered in real time with a heavy focus on real-time battles using swords. The game was demoed at a number of shows, with the battle system, story, and most of the map work being completed. Then the system was cancelled. Ino's company Warp would later sign an exclusive contract with Sega to bring the nearly finished D2 to the Dreamcast. Time had passed between the development for the M2 and the reboot, time that had Ino rethinking the whole game. He decided that if he was going to revisit the project, it would be from the ground up. A new game, set in a new location with a new story, was finished and released on the Dreamcast as D2. To this day, the original M2 game remains lost, though a number of photos, videos, and articles document its existence. Deathkeep is a 3DO exclusive Dungeons & Dragons game described as D&D meets Hexen. It was a sequel to another 3DO exclusive called Slayer, both of which offered unique gaming experiences on the system. Deathkeep was one of the last titles released on the 3DO and received high praise. An enhanced port was in the works for the M2, but not much is known about it. Beyond a PC release, the game has never been ported to another console. Descent was sold to customers as Doom, but in a ship. The game was popular, spawning a number of sequels and ports, 2 of which were planned for the M2. An enhanced version of the original game was planned as a launch title, with a PC-perfect port of the sequel to follow down the road. The origin story of Disruptor is very similar to that of D. The project was the first ever by the now iconic Insomniac Games. This game, and quite possibly the studio, would have never started had it not been for the low licensing fees and cheap development kits provided by 3DO. As the market started to shift to more powerful consoles, development was moved to the M2 and eventually released exclusively on the PlayStation. To reiterate how important 3DO's licensing fees and support were to independent developers, I leave you with this quote: "Reducing the cost of entry into the industry will bring people into it. The whole reason Disruptor exists is because an enthusiastic hobbyist could start development on the 3DO since it had cheap development hardware. We saw the prototype running on the 3DO and agreed to fund development on the PlayStation." That's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Feel free to leave a positive or negative comment letting me know your thoughts. If you would like to chat or keep up to date on channel-related news, follow me on Twitter at Jenovi. And until next time, you've been watching Retro Impressions.